We should kick off, I suppose, with the debate tonight, 9 o'clock on ITV, the first big one. How influential is that for the polls? What does it do to them?
Well, the debates always have the potential to move the dial. Someone could land a knockout blow or an absolute zinger that could really set the entire thing alight. And it doesn't happen.
Right.
The very first debate back in 2010 with Nick Clegg, and I agree with Nick, Clegg mania,
Yes.
all that sort of thing. That debate, the first debate, interestingly, not the subsequent debates, even in that election, but that very first debate did have an impact. It did change the overall picture. But
that was kind of novelty value.
And that's what I was going to say. Since then, the type of people who watch the debate has changed a great deal. The very nature of our media has changed a great deal, and the way that the politicians approach the debate has changed a great deal. So as a result, at the moment, we're in a situation where, though they have the potential to make a difference, the reality is they probably won't.
Also, the bottom line for a lot of people as well is that, as Chris just said there, a couple of what you might describe as below average, not necessarily below average politicians, but below average kind of performers, if you like, because all you've got to do is watch Prime Minister's Questions every single Wednesday, and it's not exactly, a sort of a room livener, is it? I mean, people are always constantly wanting something to happen, and nothing ever does.
Well, Keir Starmer, as a former director of public prosecutions, is probably not used to dropping jokes into his oratory, and similarly, Rishi Sunak is not the most flamboyant of characters. But in a sense, it doesn't really matter what happens on the day, because as Chris quite rightly said, most people will not be viewing it live. They will be picking up what the media talks about in the subsequent days, and indeed what's circulated, particularly nowadays, via social media. And so these things exist so that the parties and others can clip up the particular exchanges and then put their own spin on it and send it out. So really, you don't really know whether something's had an impact for days and sometimes weeks.
And it's
after.
interesting you say that, because I guess I asked Pat McFadden, who's a sort of campaign coordinator, is somebody coaching Keir Starmer to get him to perform in a particularly different or better way. But maybe there's also people sitting behind the scenes saying, make sure you get at least 3 decent clips so that we can put them out on Twitter and everybody can see them.
If you had a choice between a 5 out of 10 throughout the entire hour or 2 7 out of 10s, you'd go for the 2 7 out of 10s.
Exactly,
because of the way that media works nowadays.
Of course. Now, the big poll this morning in the Times and all sorts of other papers as well. It's a YouGov MRP survey. Much is being said about how they got it right, but I think in 2019 their last sort of correct poll was a little bit closer to the election date than this is, because we've still got a month and a bit to go. But interestingly enough, there's no mention of reform anywhere on that dial. They've got 2 seats for the Greens, possibly. They've got 2 to 4 seats for Plaid Cymru, but nothing on reform.
It's a reflection of 2 things. Firstly, it's a reflection of the fact that polling is only ever a snapshot of public opinion at the time, and as you quite rightly pointed out, this was conducted before Nigel Farage made his announcement. It's also a reflection of the difficulty that reform had in targeting specific areas. The Greens, for instance, with their 2 seats, have been working very, very hard, not on a national picture, but as much as they have been on their local. So in Bristol and in Brighton, those are the really local areas for the Greens, and Reform don't really have that. But now, with Nigel Farage's announcement, it could be, and I do stress could, that the profile of people who are supporting Reform changes, or at least evolves. Up until now, they've taken votes almost exclusively from the Conservatives. Nigel Farage's presence may enlarge things to broaden things out. But the other difficulty you have with MRP surveys, or multi-level regression with post-stratification waiting to give them their full
answer, I know why they call them MRP surveys.
As you almost certainly know, Mike, they can't take into account hyper-local factors.
No.
And there is no more hyper-local factor than Nigel Farage running in Clacton.
No, indeed. Also, there is that other episode where, and I've had this explained to me before, about sort of shy Tories who wouldn't necessarily admit to voting Tory. We believe there could be a lot of shy reformers out there who don't necessarily want to say that they want to vote for Nigel Farage, because he's such a polarising character that depending on the company you're in, people don't want to admit to liking him.
That's true, but of course, voting for Nigel Farage is only a small number of people, because he's only running in one constituency, and the degree to which he can now rebrand, if you like, reform will be an interesting thing to measure. It's certainly something we'll be
Although it
looking
would
at a lot.
appear from what we're seeing from the reaction since yesterday afternoon is that it's galvanised the Reform Party, certainly, and may well galvanise people who weren't sure about voting for them, that this is a better opportunity now to see something actually changing.
Absolutely. This focus and this momentum could be a game changer for reform. But I think and it could, for instance, it certainly brings Clacton into play.
Yeah.
It could potentially bring Ashfield, Lee Anderson's constituency into play, Boston Skegness, where Richard Tice is running. It could bring those places into play if the momentum is maintained. But what we don't know is, will this snowball or will it melt away?
Yeah,
that's one of the things we're going to be looking
an
at.
interesting question as well, because of the way the polling's been done. Because there was one poll, I think, just back end of last week, which showed Reform jumping up a little bit to sort of 15%, seemingly closing the gap on the Tories. But so we'll see how this week pans out. I mean, it's been quite flat, really, for Labour and Tory since the beginning since the election has been called. I mean, what do you see happening sort of longer term through the week?
You're absolutely right that it's important to look at the long-term trends rather than individual polls, and certainly just one individual poll is not the way to look at these things. And when you do look at the long-term trends, you see that it is pretty much flat. There hasn't been a significant change for Labour or Conservatives since the election was called, but there hasn't really been much happening to change it. But just when we thought things couldn't get any more exciting, we have Nigel Farage's announcement, and that could make the difference. It's something we'll be looking at.
Yeah, absolutely right. And so when would you see, generally speaking, the first poll that would measure what happened yesterday?
Probably today or tomorrow, depending on whether anyone's doing a snap poll. But as I say, it could well be that there's a short-term spike. But there's a difference between, as you and I have talked about many times, there's a difference between a turning point and a talking point. And we don't know yet, and people will speculate, and there are good arguments for both, but we don't know whether this is a turning point or a talking point.
I mean, at the moment, if this poll is to be believed, regardless of all the tinkering around the edges that may change, perhaps whether it's Green, whether it's Reform and whatever, it still looks like the biggest victory that Labour will ever have.
As all the polls up until this point have pointed to, regardless of whether you look at the polls with the lowest Labour lead or the highest Labour lead, they all point to a three-figure majority for Labour. But as I say, that's how things stand at the moment. It's estimated that around a third of people in the last few elections have made up their minds during the campaign about how they will vote. And of course there are the crucial two dimensions: which party they will vote for and whether they choose to vote or not. There are still big questions. Scotland, for instance, which the MRP survey it's difficult to replicate in Scotland because of the basically completely different party system up there. How Scotland performs with their 57 seats could make an enormous difference. If 30 seats go to Labour, they only have 2 at the moment. If 30 seats go to Labour, they go well towards the more than 120 gains they need to make just to get the majority of 2. If they only get 10, the task becomes much more difficult.
Well, I saw a number the other day which surprised me. I think it was something like 42% of people remain unsure of which way they're going to vote. And of course the turnout hasn't really been spoken about much, and I wonder whether the turnout might increase as a result of yesterday's announcement by Reform.
Potentially. Turnout last time was around about 2/3. The lowest we've ever had, well, in 2001 we had one election that dropped below 60%. So I think it'll be really interesting to see whether the same will be true this time. I think before Farage announced, there was a good chance that we could have seen it drop below 60% again. Now, anyone's guess.
Yeah, absolutely right. What about geography in the country? I mean, you mentioned Scotland, but is there a split in terms of, you know, when we look at the Reds and the Blues, there's that big sort of swathe that comes down from the northwest. There's a sort of bit of a liberal enclave up there in the Lake District, but, you know, it's mostly, it still looks blue. Even though, you know, because all of the big constituencies in the cities are all red, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. The big constituencies in terms of population tend to be in cities, and they tend to be Labour. The big constituencies in terms of geography, but with lower populations, tend to be Conservative. But the question is the degree to which Labour can gain in those areas that have previously been Conservative to really get over the mark by some distance to get that large majority.
And the Lib Dems are looking good in this poll, aren't they? 48 seats as opposed to 11.
That seems
surprising.
That seems large to me. Certainly that would need a very strong local game by the Lib Dems, which traditionally they have been good at. But I think picking up seats in sort of the southwest, those areas that David Cameron came along and swept up in 2015 from the Lib Dems, I think regaining some of those is possible. Also areas in
They're
certain parts of
campaigning
London.
quite heavily in the sort of southeast, aren't they?
Yeah, so southeast and southwest, I think, are areas. But to get over 30 is a big move for them. So it'd be interesting to see.
Because their last election was a disaster, wasn't it? Do you remember they were?
Well, so was the one before that.
Yeah,
but
when they went down to 11, when
Yeah.
they were punting, I can't remember her name, the Scottish woman.
Jo Swinson.
Jo Swinson, there you go. Who was going to be going home, was almost going home to prepare for government, and she didn't even get re-elected.
Yeah, she wasn't even
Lost her own seat.
going home to become an MP. Yeah, I mean, the Lib Dems have had a terrible time at general elections since 2015, but there are indications, certainly from the local elections more recently, that this may change, but they always relied on this ground game, the focus, the relentless focus on specific constituencies. Do they have the institutional knowledge to conduct that sort of campaign again? Remains to be seen.
We shall see. Well, it's going to be fascinating. As you would expect, Joe Twyman, thank you very much indeed, co-founder of the public opinion consultancy firm Delatapoll, of course. A couple of